Hello, everyone. So, today we're going to talk about life in England's colonies. So, let's get started. So, first of all, we are going to talk some about their economy. So, economic activities and trade depended a lot about or on the environment where they lived. So it was more diverse in the northern colonies than in the southern colonies. You would have more farming and such in the south, and in the north, it was based more on trade and shipping. And that has to do a lot with the geography in the north. You had mountains with thick trees, rivers, and really poor, rocky soil that was difficult to farm and unsuitable for crops. And that's not the case in all places, but it's more so the case there than in the South. And there you would also have mild and short summers and these long, brutal, cold winters. So it's a much different place. You would have smaller, independent farms. And some of the industries that were more popular were fish, whaling, shipbuilding, timber and furs, things like that. And I always found this to be fascinating, but the fish there include cod and halibut and bass and things like that. So you have more, and this is something that's a bigger characteristic of the North. You have more towns and bigger cities start to pop up in the North than in the South. So that's more public land usage up there too. So in the South, that's a lot different. You have a more agricultural economy that's centered around farming. So plantation owners or planters, they dominate society. They are essentially the top 1%. They're the people who have the most money. The bulk of the people are small farmers. And so throughout time, you have a growing slave population to keep up with this growing farm economy. Okay, and again, just to kind of reiterate some of the things that I was saying earlier, here are some of the key industries in the North, like shipbuilding, which is perfect around some of those bigger port cities. So, some of these key industries make more sense in the northern colonies because they're located on some of those larger port cities, like for shipbuilding and iron, lumber, and trade. They didn't really have many slaves up there because they didn't have many of those big farms like in the South. Then, for the southern colonies, you have major crops. So you have rice, tobacco, which is very labor intensive in itself, and then indigo. These are known as cash crops. So they require very intense slave labor. So for these, it was the thought that you had to have a lot of people to be able to produce these crops. Okay, so moving on to the lives of women, there are a lot of similarities between Northern and Southern women here, but there are a few differences too. So in colonial America, the experiences of women and children, they varied widely depending on your ethnic or your social group and from colony to colony. So obviously they had fewer rights than women and children do today, and I'm putting children into this too. Um, Yet they did have responsibilities and activities that contributed to their families and communities. So there I put children into it as well because children would take a very active role in caring for the farm and or even up north in working to help if, let's say, someone owned a business, they would help out their father or whoever, but they would not just be playing, they would be working. So I was putting children in there as well. But back to women, white women in colonial America, they had many responsibilities. They, on both sides, they oversaw managing the household, motherhood, having children, taking care of the family life, baking, sewing, educating the children as much as they could because some of these, especially poorer families on both sides, couldn't read or write. And they would also make things that were necessary for the time that were expensive to buy, like soap and candles and other things. There were no legal rights. They could not vote. They lost all their property in marriage. And then childbearing in colonial times in itself, yeah, it was very dangerous. Women and then the children with them often died during childbirth. So you have a lot of things that women went through during the time. So women, unfortunately, they were seen as less than men within society. So again, they still had to do very hard work to be able to function within society. Okay, so as far as slavery is concerned in the colonial South, slavery did exist in the northern state, or not states, excuse me, in the northern colonies, but it was a lot less. But we talked about the Atlantic slave trade already, but I did want to touch on this unique slave culture that comes forward. They adopted a really strong oral tradition. So they'd pass down songs and prayers and stories through music and storytelling. And that really is a strong feature of a lot of African tribal customs that you learned about in world history. And it helped slaves to feel a sense of cultural connection, really, with the continent they're from and from their origins. So some of these oral traditions, they were mostly there for preserving history, cultural information, and a lot of it is consistent with their oral history and African cultures. So they would pass down stories that were given to them before they were, if they were brought over, they would pass those stories down. Or if they were born in the South, they would give the stories, or they would tell the stories that were given to them. So they would also, and this always fascinated me, they picked up other aspects of tribal African culture, like herbal medicine and prayer. Many slaves, they were renowned for their medical skills. So often, whenever, let's say that someone on a plantation was really sick and medicine at the time couldn't do anything for them, you would see nurses or white doctors. They would go to these slaves who knew some of these herbal remedies that they weren't familiar with. And so this could also be used to their detriment, to the white doctors' detriment as well, because they would use it as a form of resistance, because they could poison slave masters if a slave master was sick, or they could kill their best livestock. So one way that Africans figured out that they could get back and resist to their masters and to the plantation owners, besides physical resistance, would be they would run away. They would run away some. They would slow down their pace of work. They would deliberately break plantation equipment, or they would destroy crops. But there were different things that they would do. If you did something that was really bad, of course, there were brutal beatings and there were punishments that went along with it. There were outright rebellions, speaking of resistance, like the Stono Rebellion. The Stono Rebellion, it occurred near the Stono River Bridge, and that's in Charleston, or near Charleston. It ended with the death of 60 people. And it was led by an Angolan named Jimmy. And so it started with slaves that were breaking into a store, and they were going to steal weapons and supplies, and everything went bad. And they left 23 people dead. So as they marched, overseers of the plantations were killed, and actually people who wanted nothing to do with it, other slaves who who saw that this may go really wrong, they were forced to join it as well. In the end, they had reached the river, and white colonists descended on them and killed most of the rebels. And the survivors that were left, they sold them off into slavery into the West Indies. So it did not end well for them. And so it was tough to have any sort of slave uprising. And they almost always failed. And that's why there was some of those reluctant slaves who didn't want to participate because they didn't think that it was going to turn out in their favor. Okay, moving to some policies as far as the economy is concerned. It's interesting to take a look to see how the British would make money and make a profit off of the colonies. So here we're going to talk about mercantilism. So mercantilism, it's a British economic policy, and it was aimed to use the American colonies to increase state power and finances. What they wanted to do was they wanted to achieve a positive trade balance. They wanted to make more money, and they wanted to expand in power and influence. They wanted to be an even bigger superpower, basically. So if you take a look at this picture, I'm not going to point too much because other things will pop up. But you see on the left that there is someone who looks like a monarch, and it says mother country. Here, that would be considered England. And you see that the colonies are providing, and they're dressed up as servants or maids, and they're providing things on platters. That would be the colonies providing different things to benefit the mother country, like gold and silver is pictured, food stuff, so food, and then raw materials. So these are meant to benefit the mother country. This is the economic system for that. And the main purpose here is a good trade balance so they can continue to trade positively, so they can become more wealthy and they can be more powerful and influential. Now, what is interesting is eventually there are some rules that are put into place about how the colonies are supposed to trade. As the English Civil War came to a close, the British, they decided to bring more control over colonial trade relations, and we will talk about the Navigation Acts again. So these are a series of laws that were passed by Parliament, and they basically imposed restrictions on how the colonies were to trade. So first of all, certain products can only be sold to England. These are very, very labor-intensive cash crops that they can make a huge profit off of. So you're talking sugar, tobacco, rice. Then any good that is sent to Europe must first pass through England. There are many reasons why for this. First of all, they want to get their share. They want to get what they want. They want to make sure towards the end that there's no smuggling of things as well. So there are a plethora of reasons why they would want those goods to go through England first. And then this adds to it. It's not really a part of the acts, but just FYI, the Navigation Acts are not strictly enforced, and we'll talk about why, but this is something that helps contribute to problems down the road. Okay, so here is where that comes into play. So you have King James II, who we had talked about with Jamestown, his namesake, and we have been talking about for a few days. I've mentioned him at least. So he is replaced. He's overthrown, and he is replaced by William and Mary, and this is a bloodless revolution. So with this, it takes some power away from James, from the king, and then it gives more power to Parliament. To Parliament. And so what ends up happening is throughout all of this, the English, they stop supervising the colonies as much as they were. And so this lack of supervision is called salutary neglect. So you start to see different colonial assemblies gain power. Merchants can start doing essentially what they want. And this is probably the most important part. The colonists begin getting used to freedoms. They are not being told consistently and like what they're supposed to do. So they start getting used to kind of being their own entity and doing what they want to do. So keep this in mind further down the road. All right, and that is all for today. I hope you have a good rest of your day.